Welcome to Vision Chats, where the only thing that matters is the future. I'm Farouk, Vice Provost at Johns Hopkins University, and I am delighted to be with a group of thought leaders and entrepreneurs who will have a conversation with me today about the future of online learning, education technology, entrepreneurship in this space, and just the future of learning and of work and where things will go. So with me today is Ashwin Damera, who is the co-founder and CEO of Emeritus, an online learning company that makes higher education and learning content available from top tier universities to the rest of the world. Welcome, Ashwin. Thank you for being with us. Kate Volzer, who is the co-founder and CEO of Wisr, which helps students identify colleges all around the country and is now part of the Education Advisory Board. Thank you for joining us, Kate. And Samyr Qureshi, who is the co-founder and CEO of Knack, an online peer-to-peer learning company, and has done quite a bit of experiments and projects and work with a number of universities, including Johns Hopkins University. And I think they have a great potential in the future. So really looking forward to a great conversation with the three of you. It's been a really interesting year this year. As I put in many statements before, I don't know what we would have done this year without a robust EdTech sector to help us get through a year of pandemic where most students and learners and educators and teachers and even families were locked up at home and were prevented from doing what we normally would do in person. And sometimes I try to imagine how we would have gone through this year with our young kids going to school, our college students, our educators, maybe even us doing our work without a robust sector. Like, what if this happened 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and how we would have managed? So in a way, I'm very, very grateful for the robust technology that many people like you have spent years in developing. What has this pandemic revealed to us that we didn't already know about learning and about education and about work, according to you?
I think what Kate Volzer from Wisr here. Farouk, thanks for having us. This is so cool to be a part of this conversation. And guys, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on everything. I think what I was most impressed with and struck me as sort of the sort of best outcome of the whole pandemic is, I think historically higher ed and even K-12 educators were maybe a little bit more resistant to being willing to try new technologies, unplug new technologies if it doesn't work, kind of adopting things more quickly. And I heard regularly on either client calls or sales meetings where admissions offices would say, their word of the year is pivot. And I mean, I think everybody on this line knows that pivot is a regular thing that startups do. And so it's kind of cool to see that willingness to try stuff and experiment and a tolerance for failure, maybe a little bit more in a space that is prone to, you get to your destination, you get to graduation, and failure maybe is not a thing that's worn with a badge of honor. So I think that was probably my best takeaway. And I think that extends down to K-12. My neighbor is the tech coordinator for our school district. She's in second grade, teaches second grade. And even them at the school district level, she's adopting new technology like VR stuff for inside of a second grade classroom. Whereas I don't think that families would have been comfortable teaching their kids at home or even having that experience in the classroom. So I think it's, cradle to grave.
Mm-hmm. And if I could just add on to that, it's amazing how the digital adoption of online spans all spheres of education. Like my son, who's 5 years old, is on his laptop, he's learning. My parents, I won't disclose how old they are, they may not want me to, but way older, are also learning online, and everybody in between is. And that is, by the way, the other point on that is it's a global phenomenon. It's not restricted to a geography. And so it's amazing just to see the digital disruption. And I think some of this will continue for the years to come. On the other, that's on the demand side. On the supply side, one of the things we work a lot with, top tier institutions. And, at times there are faculty as well as decision makers who believe that, hey, I can't do this online. And I think to some extent, the needle has moved a little bit on that view to say, hey, maybe I can do this online and maybe there are really solid learning outcomes, but I need to do it slightly differently. So maybe one of the lasting impacts from the pandemic may be that you're going to see a lot more online or blended adoption, even from top tier institutions globally.
That's interesting. When we had our existing campus partners and the pandemic happened, it was sort of a crazy moment for the world, right? And a lot of times what we wanted to do as an organization was reach out to these campuses and say, how might we be additionally helpful to you all? Forget the revenue, forget that. We don't even know what the world's going to look like. It was such a shock for everyone. One of the things that we had heard a lot of campuses do is say, we're going to take an additional step and speak as much as we can to our students to figure out what they would need and what they would like to have in a period of uncertainty. And so many of those campuses, I think, realized they uncovered a lot more, not just pandemic related, but uncovered so much more about student need. And that's informing practices, regardless if they're in person, online, hybrid, whatever it may be. So it was an opportunity to basically do deep user research, deep customer research, and it was forced upon them because really you had to listen to how you can serve these folks in a time where a traditional model maybe isn't going to work. And so we had so many campuses come back and say, we actually learned so much more, not necessarily by throwing a bunch of tools out there right away, but by first doing even more, listening to our students and understanding what's the top priority, and then building around that, not just, for a temporary period during COVID, but to inform practices going forward. And as an organization, that's dedicated to supporting campuses, we hope to do the same thing. And I think one of the things we were figuring out was, okay, a lot of students prior to the pandemic were using tutoring about 60, 70% in person, and the difference online. Obviously, things have flipped almost entirely, being majority online. But even we as an organization don't know what that's going to look like afterwards. To say, is our users going to want to stay online? Are they going to want to come back in person? We see both sides of the coin, where some say there's going to be a tidal wave of in-person. Others are saying this is permanent consumer behavior change. So there's so much that we're all learning. And I was really pleased and excited to see higher ed take that extra step and go talk directly to students in a very empathetic manner. And I think, as Kate mentioned earlier, to underscore the idea of them being nimble, I hope that stays, and I hope that agility is sort of embedded now in the world of education.
Yeah, do you think that there will be a snapback into how things were, and maybe even worse than how things were? Let me paint a context here for you. There was a period at the beginning of the pandemic where we had this mass adoption of technology because we had to, and I remember very vividly a day when I just walked around the house taking a break between Zoom calls, and literally every member of my family was in front of a screen doing what they were doing. So my kids are learning on Zoom. My wife is doing stuff on screen, and then I had to come back to my next meeting that was online. And that was just not one day; it was day after day after day. And I remember so one of my kids is in kindergarten, and her teacher at the beginning of the pandemic was panicking. She said, I have taught for 30 years in person. I don't know how to do this. And to see the progression mid-year point, and as I was talking to her, and she was saying, I'm getting a lot more comfortable now, and I'm actually starting to innovate. And I could see some of that innovation through the Zoom calls that she was having with my daughter to the end of the year, where she's feeling like a pro. But at the same time, as I paint this picture of mass adoption and then adjustment, now as we're all getting vaccinated, or most of us getting vaccinated, and we're starting to put together the blueprint for return, whatever that means, after the pandemic next year, that's in colleges and in schools, I'm hearing just a lot of themes of just resistance to continue this growth in the digital space. The word hybrid is thrown around, but I don't think that I don't feel like that people really mean it. I think that it's more of a crutch to just say, yeah, we won't lose that. But there's just a real desire to want to snap back to an in-person, fully in-person experience. And I worry a little bit about that we will lose the opportunity to learn from everything that we have gone through this year. Is that something that you're thinking about?
I think, yeah. I mean, people crave human connection, and being in person is a big part of, how you live your life, and you get to know people, develop relationships. And I think that's okay. I think the pressure is definitely on for entrepreneurs. I mean, if you're going to support this hybrid or have a heavy emphasis on virtual, how do you make sure that the people that are showing up in person don't feel disconnected, or so that the digital, like, I worry a little bit about, like a virtual learning experience, like online classrooms. If you're going to have some people showing up on campus and some people showing up online, how do you make it so that one experience doesn't feel worse than the other? And maybe it's like a negative frame, but I think there's pressure on entrepreneurs like us to think about, well, how can we bridge that gap with tech? How do we need to evolve? Schools already met us, right? Like they moved and did a lot of stuff online. Now it's like, okay, now if you want to have this hybrid experience, where are the innovations needing to come from the tech side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, no doubt the change is immense, right? I will be the first to tell you, as an organization, we were fully in person. I mean, 3 months before COVID, we opened a beautiful office in downtown Tampa, right? Painted our walls with our murals. We felt so excited about having that in-person feeling. And our thesis was always, if we built a platform that supported in-person interactions first, we could always go virtual. But to start virtual and go in person was very difficult. So we very intentionally started that way. And, pandemic hits, and we were growing, and we didn't want to hire folks and ask them to move in the middle of that. And we didn't want to create an inequity where existing employees felt like, oh, but now we're hiring people in different states. Does that mean they get to stay remote? So, we essentially, management thought about it for a long time, and we said upside, downside on both, going fully remote, staying, fully in person, or even a hybrid setup. And we said, it's zero sum ultimately. The upside of being in person, I believe, is irreplaceable, at least today, right? Maybe when AR and VR get more advanced and holograms and technology like that becomes more accessible, we could say differently. But I really believe in person is very difficult to replace. But the amount of flexibility, the happiness, the opportunity you can really have to feel empowered and free in a remote environment is also very advantageous. And so for me, it's zero sum. And I wonder how higher ed looks at this, because as Kate said, I mean, there is an opportunity, and I know, Farouk, you talk a lot about scale and impact, right? Virtual enables that, but there's a lot that is difficult to replicate. And I hope that when folks say hybrid, they totally mean that we're going to take those learnings, we're going to maybe stay heavy online, but we're going to incorporate these in-person elements, because I think we're humans, we're social creatures, and it's impossible to keep this be the norm forever, right? There has to be some sort of mix in there. So that's my wishful thinking at minimum.
Yeah, I have a wishful angle to that as well, which is, if you think about the opportunity in higher ed, it's a very large market, $3 trillion, but less than 2% of that pre-pandemic was actually online, right? Any course that has completely online or partially online, it's a minuscule number. Now, my sense is that number has moved a lot during COVID, probably double digit, and it'll probably dial back, and we all understand the need for the social connection. But there's an angle here of the student and the learner as well, especially non-traditional students, people who can't come to campus. And I think that one of the biggest kind of opportunity losses for higher ed as an industry is if we don't expand the ability to attract these non-traditional students who, could be somebody far away in let's say, in India, Southeast Asia, somewhere in Latin America. It could be somebody who has a full-time job, can't do, full-time program, maybe doesn't even need it, just needs a short refresher course. All of these students who might not have been able to come to an on-campus experience, who virtually over the last 12 months, have been able to experience high-quality education. I would love for us to find ways that even as the traditional students come back, we think about, and collectively, this is higher education institutions and enablers like us, about how we can expand access to those non-traditional students through digital methods. That's my wishful thinking.
I agree. And that is the thing. I'm super worried about that in doing panels like this. The thing that usually gets asked is like, what keeps you up at night about the state of higher education? And I'm very worried about, like, there are certain people that had a very good pandemic in that, like, they kept their jobs, their companies grew very quickly, but there are a lot of people that lost their jobs, are worse off, lost family members. And so now, like, thinking about the K-12 space and even the kind of non-traditional learners, which, at some point it's going to flip and we're going to have a lot more people going back to school because education is so accessible in a lot of other forms. But that gap between the haves and have-nots and figuring out how to solve it. And that was one of the reasons that we started to, like, we added a whole new module, I think is what we're calling them now. But it's all about bridging that gap from having these students that are in remote locations that maybe can't afford to fly and travel. And Farouk, as you were talking and as Samyr was talking to, I was thinking, like, I should probably invest in some travel related companies, because if we're going hybrid, more people are going to be flying and staying in hotels. So thanks for the stock market inspiration there, but totally agree. Closing that gap, I think, is like absolutely critical.
I mean, I think synchronous is so I just met with a campus earlier today and asked, hey, what portion of your program is going to stay async versus synchronous? And I think there is a difference, right, from hitting play and watching something versus having a live individual on the other side. And I think I'm hoping that campuses will keep synchronous elements, although async is likely more accessible in that it can be viewed on demand, et cetera. But having sync first, I think, is going to be key to engaging, especially those non-traditional populations. If you think about their typical age, they grew up in a world where technology was not at the focal point as much as it is now, where kids are being born with iPhones and iPads in their hands. And so, if there's an opportunity to preserve the human element as much as possible, I think that's key. That's what we believe as an organization is important. I know, Kate, you're a community-based organization as well. Students want to talk to each other. There is a co-curricular component. The student affairs world has to really stay alive as much as the academic affairs world may want to go asynchronous. Async can be more scalable. I understand that. I worry at times of how much we're just going to go into an on-demand, education like Netflix model, where it's less live and synchronous. But, again, that's just one perspective.
So the way I'm thinking about this is sort of from the lens of my software engineers loved working from home, right? They're way more productive in an uninterrupted environment. The salespeople or the social people loved going to sit in the office, make our grilled cheese and do our soups or whatever and hang out at lunch. I think that same sort of notion extends to the learning environment. I don't actually think that synchronous learning is the best for everybody. What if you process things differently and you need to read more before that you can follow up and ask questions? Different managers have different styles for that too. I have one manager that would much prefer to, that's weird to have a manager again. I have one manager that would much prefer to have all the information ahead of time so that they can process that information and react while we're having our one-to-one conversation. And then I've got another person that loves to spitball and brainstorm. And it doesn't mean that one of their styles are better than the others. They just have different styles.
It's a this and, right? It's not this or, it's this and. And I think it's just a matter of how you're going to stack those and how those two are going to play together.
Yeah. So going through the acquisition there with Education Advisory Board, EAB bought 4 companies, I think, in the past 12 months or 18 months. And so now we're at the point where we're starting to talk about how will we go back to having an in-person, how will we have office environments? Wisr went fully remote about 3 months before the pandemic shut down. Honestly, it was a fiscal decision. I didn't want to spend the money on an office space anymore. I wasn't getting value out of having my engineers being distracted by my shenanigans, making the grilled cheese and soup at lunch, right? It was better for us if people were remote. But we did make sure that we had time for coming together in person, and that was built in. It wasn't like I was overall going to spend that much less money on my operating budget because we would have done in-person things and paid for that. But it was a productivity thing. And I think that people now that they've experienced that, I think you're going to be really hard pressed as a manager to go back to that. And so EAB is the Wisr team is staying fully remote. There's a level of optionality for when people will go back into offices or not. It's just totally shifted the whole culture of the company. And it's interesting to sort of be the outsider. I mean, I'm in right now, but the newest kid on the block to experience that culture and that shift in business culture.
Yeah, personalities and preferences have a big part of this. I mean, no doubt.
Yeah, isn't there a case though for equity to use the approach of asynchronous learning and even just synchronous as long as it's online to achieve scale? I mean, I've always thought that the way to equity and the way to bridge that gap between the haves and the have-nots, as you say, Kate, is to lean into technology and offer a lot online that is hard to offer to everyone in an in-person environment. Once you start talking physical space, you're already putting a cap on how many people get into the room. The beauty of these things online is that these digital spaces have elastic boundaries, if you will, like you can fit in as many people as you want fairly easily. That's one. Two, I think the on-demand format allows for maximum access all the time. Ashwin, you're in that environment and in that business where you're trying to make online content, learning content available to people all around the world. I can't imagine how that is done in a physical world all the time. So what are your reactions about that?
I love the way you kind of set this up. So, I always say that, look, it's great to teach 30 people intimately in a classroom. It doesn't change the world. It's only 30 people. It's great that you can have a class that has 300,000 people enrolled, maybe in one of the MOOCs or something else. But if your learning outcomes are so poor that nobody is a different person after the course than they were when they enrolled, that doesn't change the world either. Now, both have a role to play. But if you could combine both and say, look, could you actually teach 30,000 students, but with very high learning outcomes, right? That's kind of where all of us would say, hey, that's a great problem to solve, because then that amplifies the learning, potentially changes people's lives, careers, and eventually the world. And I think that's very difficult to do in a physical setting. It's very difficult to do in synchronous live teaching. And you have to marry asynchronous and synchronous and do that in a very judicious manner. And by the way, when you think about that problem again, for us, at Emeritus, we work with, top tier institutions to take their online courses across the world. So we always think of this from a global phenomenon. If you're a student, for example, who, let's say in Peru, Chile, Mexico, somewhere in the Middle East or say Southeast Asia, where English is not your foreign language, and you have to learn synchronously. You are doing two things at one time. You're translating in your native language. You're also trying to learn, and that's cognitive overload. And maybe you don't even need it if pedagogically that's not the case. So if you can have asynchronous, many of our courses, we go back and look at the learning data. People come back and watch those video lectures 2 times, 3 times. Some people breeze through. Some people come back and watch it. But asynchronous does give you a lot of flexibility. At the same time, though, you need those human-to-human experiences, right? And so you got to think about how do you blend this? If I make one prediction, by the way, post-pandemic, even when faculty come back to their classrooms and start teaching in class, they are going to bring so many tools that they learned over the last 12 months, so many maybe simulations or role plays or tech tools into that experience. And they're going to question themselves, do I need to stand up and deliver a standard 80-minute lecture? Or is some part of this like a pre-read to some video lectures, etc., and I focus more on the discussion? And I suspect, we're going to have very deep discussions on just how faculty facilitate even in-person experiences.
Yeah, that's very thought-provoking, and it's making me think of the faculty who really struggled with online learning at the beginning of the pandemic. Universities even saw a number of long-time faculty who just took their retirements at the beginning of the pandemic because they just did not want to have to deal with it, and others who struggled with it. We also had a rank of faculty who did really well with the adjustment and picked up the tools that you've mentioned, and now they go back to it. So now let me set it up on the other side of it, where now faculty have learned too much, if you will. We had too much of a good thing, and they love this online mode of teaching. And they don't want to go back to the classroom, but students are saying, this is in traditional residential colleges, I want the student experience, as Samyr was explaining, and I want to be in college. I want to be in the classroom, and I want to come back. And now we're hitting a different type of existential crisis that in higher education, where we're trying to figure out how to meet the expectations of both the learners and the educators as we try to transition back into the future. Any thoughts about that?
Do students want the in-person learning experience, or do they want to be able to go hang out with their friends at parties and like do clubs and organizations on campus?
Yeah, I think they want community. There's no question about it. That is what they really miss, is but I think there are some parts of the classroom that they want, maybe not the big lectures, etc. I think we're seeing that, and I even saw in one of the comments here that in the chat box that someone said that the students actually want to have on-demand access to lectures and to materials and to PDFs. But at the same time, I think they want to process that learning in person in probably smaller groups and cohorts. So it's probably a little bit of both. But you're right. I think for the most part, what they want is the community experience within in the residential community experience.
I don't know if you all have followed founder of Udemy, Gagan Biyani, started a cohort-based sort of next generation university. There's so many iterations of this, right? And some go direct to student and essentially are trying to create a new university. Others are partnering, right? Similar to maybe what Ashwin's doing. And one of the key things he talked about from what they learned was the cohort, right? You don't necessarily need to be in a classroom with each other, next to each other, discussion, et cetera. But the idea of being in a cohort of like-minded folks that are in a similar space while still having diversity, obviously, is irreplaceable, right? You want that shoulder-to-shoulder contact, not necessarily in the classroom, but within that same educational pathway. And Ashwin, I'm curious what you see. I mean, you're dealing with students across the world, and you're dealing with maybe different time zones and things like that. How do you all bring that in and infuse that, if at all, right now?
I think, you absolutely raise a great point, Samyr. The cohort-based learning is important for what we do because it allows people to be at the same point of a course, and then you can have discussions around that. But in a global environment, there is a cost of assembling a cohort. When we create these online courses, which can enroll 200, 300 people around, they come from 50 plus countries. So let's imagine you're in a negotiations course and you want them to come live to the platform and negotiate with each other. You're suddenly talking about working adults who have to figure out different time zones coming into the platform at the same time. And there is an effort to make that work. Now, in the classroom, in some sense, especially if it's a degree program, you have captive audience. They more or less have to turn up. Some of them may not. And so it's a lot easier to do that. But then that scales a lot less, right? So it's always, I think any instructor, to the earlier question about faculty's preferences, when you use any tool pedagogically, whether it's in-person, synchronous live, asynchronous live, etc., you have to be making these trade-offs about the effectiveness of the pedagogy, and then also how do you assemble the people and the effort that it takes to do that, right? So it's never an easy question, and I don't think there'll ever be a simple answer for that. Like, depending on the subject area, the type of topic, the faculty's own preferences, there's going to be many different answers to this question. But one thing I will say, though, that the technology that enables some of these synchronous interactions, cohort-based interaction, that is more robust today than it was 5 years ago. And it's probably going to be more robust 5 years from now. And so, like, I come back to my first comment, I hope we continue on this digital adoption path because some of the constraints of the technology posed are going away. So maybe the constraints are more kind of in our mind or maybe in some of our setups.
Farouk, I'd have a question for you looking at it from the latter half of the student experience going into careers. Project-based learning, experiential learning, e-portfolios, things like these experiences that aren't necessarily live, but can actually be captured and rolled up into credentials or rolled up into the workforce. I would imagine async has been advantageous for that because a lot of those sort of projects are independently managed and wrapped up. Or what are you seeing on the career side rather than the active learning in the classroom as students are exiting and hoping to wrap this up and take it with them? I would imagine async has been great for Hopkins and for the thesis you've had.
It has, and we've seen the number of students engaged increase exponentially, actually. So in all of those opportunities, I've always thought that the two most important factors in getting students prepared for postgraduate opportunities are immersive experiences and mentoring. And both of those have thrived in a pandemic world where we completely leaned on digital tools. Even though at the beginning we were a little bit nervous because, like the first thing that we started to hear at the beginning of the internships, it was spring of last year, was internships disappearing. And that's obviously a very strong component of experiential learning, research, undergraduate research especially. That started to disappear. But then soon after that, we started to think of it in a broader way. And what allowed us to not only keep going, but thrive was to be able to fund students to construct their own experiential learning. And for us to be able to provide them all of those materials online, to provide them the support, but then to just say, this is your opportunity to go ahead and create the awesome immersive experience that you may want. And same thing for mentoring. So I think the whole field of just preparing students for the world of work, in my opinion, has done much better in the pandemic world than in the past, because this last year has forced us not only to pivot, but to actually just completely reinvent the process and maybe do it right for once. What that leads me to is a question about the earlier part of that journey. So from, career is on the back end, but what about the front end and students choosing colleges? I know, Kate, you're in this business, so maybe you can comment on this. What I noticed last year, this time last year, when students were starting to commit to colleges, what I noticed is that high school seniors were making different decisions about the different colleges that they would attend. They said no to colleges that normally they would say yes to. In order to stay closer to home and save money, they took a year off. That was really interesting behavior that I picked up on just anecdotally. I wonder if you saw that those trends play out. Are now students and families making different decisions about colleges and are considering the cost of education differently, and are putting a different value on higher education than they have in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think that short answer, yes, I think people are valuing higher education differently, because the reason that a first-time freshman, kind of a traditional student, the reason that you pay $70,000 or whatever it is to go to the University of Chicago is the high quality learning experience that you get in these small classroom settings. But also, my gosh, you're on this fabulous campus that has a phenomenal student experience. And I went there twice, so I'm just going to talk about the University of Chicago. Like, no real skin in the game there outside of being a proud alum. But then you have parents saying, well, like, why am I paying for, the bill of the gym that you bought however many years ago, or that climbing wall in the rec center, if my kid can't use it? So I think it's a perception, but I think those of us that are in the business also know that actually a lot of that undergrad experience, that bill is subsidized by the university. And that's not really where, the cost of a true education at U Chicago is really something like $200,000, but the university picks up the rest of the tab to make it more affordable. So I think there's that line of questioning. There's a gap in knowledge. And I don't know though, I mean, is there data yet about how, maybe Ashwin, like how did online teaching go? And is this like a longer term study? Like, is the online delivery model okay for learning? Because, so what I was thinking about too is, related to the in-person experience, sort of, questioning the value of education generally is, well, the reason that people don't get to graduation isn't necessarily because, isn't it because you can't find your community, your sense of belonging, a whole lot of other things that aren't related to, I received all of my lessons in the classroom. So I'm kind of in the camp of who cares if it's delivered online, and please call me out on this. I'm not, from the academy side of things, but if the faculty want to deliver it online and then students can improve their quality of life outside of it and still have the collegiate experience, and schools are, paying to build out these super communities that allow for immersive experiences or whatever, maybe that's okay. And the focus is on labs and discussion groups rather than lecture halls.
It's a very difficult question to answer. How well it was the online teaching of the last 12 months or more received? In fact, perhaps you shouldn't ask that question to people who enrolled in a classroom degree program and then who would learn mostly online. I'm pretty sure that will be a very bad way to judge the quality of those online courses. But if you actually ask people who've taken online, say, short courses, degree courses that were designed and meant to be delivered completely online, I think those learning outcomes are fairly comparable to what happens in class. In terms of people who complete, what happens to their career, etc., I'm not sure that the community piece is fully addressed on that piece. But I do believe that, we're starting to kind of talk a little bit about this, is that the way you create an online course and the way you teach an online course is fundamentally different from the way you do that in the classroom, right? And I think there was a comment here as well about, in the version 1 of online, it was lecture capture, put it online. And at the end of that, you ask a multiple choice question and suddenly you have a course. And I think, and I don't want to be critical, but, many people will experience their first online course through a MOOC, Coursera, edX, FutureLearn. There are 140 million people there. And they will believe that this is what an online learning experience is. And my simple point is that is an online learning experience, but the more high-touch, cohort-based, designed for online. I'll give you just one example, right? How do faculty teach mostly in semester programs? Like the biggest piece of your assessment and your grade comes at the end of the semester. It's either a massive project or a final exam. We all know that after 5 weeks in an online course, students' attention starts to drop away. So even if you're doing a 10-week online course, if you put that big assignment or project in week 10, you're basically setting up the student for failure, because by that time, their work has caught up with them, their family's caught up with them, they kind of bored the medium. So when you design this, one of the things that we suggest to faculty, working very collaboratively with them, is, look, can you break up that big assignment into smaller assignments and offer it in week 2, week 4, week 6, week 8? Could you offer it in a way that's also relevant to the student? Can they apply that assignment to their industry or the personal part of our personal situation? So it's not just instructional design, it's also motivational design. How do you help people get excited by the content that they finish? And if you do that kind of design, I think the learning outcomes are fairly compelling. Again, please don't interpret this to say that online is better. I'm making no such statement. There are certain cases where actually online perhaps is not good. But if that kind of effort goes into design, and by the way, online has so much analytics that we can use to redesign and get better, I do believe that it is a compelling medium to teach with high quality outcomes at scale.
It's fascinating. Go ahead.
As you're saying that, I'm just kind of jumping to then what is the thing that makes somebody successful and complete their degree and get to graduation and transition to a job? Like how much, just playing devil's advocate here, like how much does the education component of college matter to becoming a better citizen of the world? Or are you learning more from the community that you're in? And something isn't going well at a lot of schools. There are lots of schools with low graduation rates, and they deliver classes in person and online.
It's a classic student affairs versus academic affairs sort of vibe of like, hey, is it the in the classroom? Is it the out of the classroom? I think I would argue it's almost equally both, maybe sometimes even more the out of classroom, especially if you're looking at new models of micro internships, project-based learning, things that are more relevant. I think the most frustrating question that I remember when I was younger and in classes and I get bored and want to pull my hair out is how does this apply to what I'm going to do after I get out of school?
Yeah.
And if I didn't answer that question, I didn't care. And I think, yeah, you can instruct the knowledge in the classroom, but there needs to be the connectivity to life after college.
You're not everybody though. I went to school with a lot of people that really did care about the learning environment. Like I have an older brother that's a doctorate in applied math. And like, if I ask him about math, he still doesn't like stop talking about math. Yeah. So he's in like the other camp. And I'm the one that was like, walking to class and I see people playing cornhole or bags, depending on what state you live in. And I was like, you know what, that sounds like more fun. I'm not going to go to school right now.
Yeah.
But since we're talking about the future of higher ed and EdTech, there is a debate or maybe a discussion going on right now, which is, do you even need a college degree? Or are alternate credentials or other ways to learn? And I think more than ever, I think the world in general is more open to this idea, right? It may sound blasphemous to some people, and I would tread very cautiously about this, but there is a case to be made that in certain situations, especially, for example, if it's hard skills, coding, data science, cybersecurity type of skills, could you go to a bootcamp provider who actually teaches you that skill, connects you with an employer? You save 4 years or at least 2 years of a master's program potentially. Now, even as I make this, I think some of the things that you lose out in that is the life skills that college teaches, right? And so I think the jury's still out on, is that the best direction for us, society or in higher education to tread for? But we are starting to see a lot of startups try to solve that problem, which is the alternate credential problem. And very interesting funding options emerge for people who want to pursue those options, including income share and other forms of funding. So that's one area that I think we should keep an eye out on, as we think about the future of higher ed.
As somebody that has hired people, I will say though that if somebody doesn't know how to write, that's problematic. So if you went straight to a boot camp and you can't form an argument, it's not going to work out. I suppose unless they're in we're a much larger company and you have a very specific function, then it could be okay. But
I would argue that's the stuff. I mean, again, we're in the world of higher ed and I value the degrees, but I would argue that's the stuff that's easier to teach, because if you don't have resilience, time management, critical thinking, problem solving, if you are not a good team player, that is inherently something that is very difficult to change in an individual at a later stage. And to what Ashwin was saying earlier, I had heard Brennan Bustede speak a few years ago, who's I think pretty well vocal on this topic around the flipped model where employers are actually reaching into K-12 and it's work first, school is sort of secondary. So it flips. Today you see a lot of people, hey, I work at an accounting firm and then in the evenings I'm getting my MBA. The future could very much be I'm working I'm working full time at an earlier stage. So what your typical 18 to 24-year-old might be working part-time, you're actually working full-time and learning part-time to really kind of help allow that employer or organization to train for their hard skills, which is more aligned, but allow the educational experience to wrap around that for the soft skill development and obviously the additional academic content that's important. It's just, the more I've hired folks and the more I've had to work with people, if the individual is hungry, passionate, and willing to learn and can work well with others, almost always from an employer standpoint, I think that trumps how many credentials they may have. And I think that's happening more and more.
Yeah, I don't necessarily care about the packaging, but all of the components that would go into a traditional effort to get a bachelor's degree, I think are important skills as you transition into the workforce. Whether you accumulate those through boot camps or I can even think of other examples, that it's probably okay so long as you can prove it. But then the certification, the bachelor's degree is like a stamp of I went through all of this, and me as the employer, I know that they went through some rudimentary learning how to write. They had to do some basic math, science, that kind of stuff.
Kate and Ashwin, you both work with top tiers. Don't you feel like many of them are holding on to that credential in that we are the only Ivy League or the campus that can stamp this? and they may feel threatened by open credentials and things where the name is now getting a little bit more diluted, or it's easier to acquire some of these skills without the rubber stamp. I feel like there is a resistance by a lot of campuses to say we are very traditional around this is our degree. Ashwin, you're partnering with a lot of these campuses. What are you hearing or seeing in that way?
Look, I think they, at least for the top tier, they really don't have to worry about this. Right? They turn away far more people than they can accept. And I do agree that there is a lot to be said of whether it's 4 years in undergrad or 2 years in master's of a holistic education that you can't get kind of in some of these non-traditional providers. I worry more, there are 20,000 universities in the world. There are 4,000 just in the US. So take the 3,001st to the 4,000 university. I worry for them because, now you start seeing some companies, for example, like Outlier, that are starting to teach the first year of an undergrad program and allowing you to credit transfer from that to somewhere else, right? And so, I do, by the way, think in higher ed, disruption will first come kind of in continuing education, then maybe at the master's level, then to undergrad. So I think undergrad will still take some time. So I'm not worried about that. But the question, I come back to, Kate, to your point, the 4-year undergrad experience, great experience, but not everybody can afford it. And so what are the options that higher ed offers those people who can't afford it? And that's where I think the place for these non-traditional or alternate credentials is it also makes access easier. It's easier for somebody to go get a job, work for 4 or 5 years, and then come back and do a master's program or something else. So stay in touch through continuing education, build the other skills that they want. At least there's an option available, I believe. And so I believe that these alternate credential providers do play a role in society because not everybody wants to come out of college with a huge debt.
So related to the highly selectives, I think that the delivery model that particular group believes in is the in-person experience and the residential college, the learning that happens when you're in the lounges. So I think it's literally like there's physically only so much space on campus unless you're going to go buy a bunch of hotel rooms. So I think it's genuinely a capacity constraint. I don't think it's like we're trying to create some sort of line between the uneducated and educated. And it actually, those schools are extremely affordable for people from low income backgrounds. You don't have to pay anything to go to those schools. And then oftentimes you get money to do internships. Yeah, I know you're looking at me like that, but if you're a low income family, you pay nothing to go to most of those schools and you get grants and scholarships to have internships.
Yeah, you have to get in though.
Right. Yes. You have to get in. There's a small population that gets in.
Well, and those that are prepared to even be able to get in versus those that cannot.
There's a whole, yes, there. And I know that, I'm on a number of committees that are working toward improving access to college at those institutions in partnership with community-based organizations, and those campuses are spending a lot of money to improve their processes.
Yeah.
Now you're starting to see, standardized testing be on shakier ground, and again, a lot of these highly selectives are maybe nervous about that. Well,
there's this cool thing that I'm going to totally blank on the name that Salcon is doing from like an offshoot of the Khan Academy, but you can what is it?
Is it the Schoolhouse World, the free tutoring?
Yes, that one. And so it's like you can get tutored to get credentialed. And then I know University of Chicago used that as a part of the pilot to help kids that are from all different places in the world access to, test prep, being able to take the ACT, SAT, whatever to help. There are new ways that are coming out where schools are open to pilots and doing interesting things to level the playing field.
We had a campus, a newer institution, Florida Polytechnic University, which is historically, it's a new campus. They're going for a very competitive STEM student. And when things like standardized testing were becoming less of a certain assessment of a student, they actually partnered with us to use their top students as tutors, and they paid their own students to be tutors in calculus classes across the country for free. And they were embedding them in classrooms to help the teachers, but to also help increase the brand recognition of that university. So if Kate is needing free tutoring, she's getting help from Samyr, who's Florida Poly. I can not just tell you about, how to pass your calculus exam, but I can talk to you about the benefits of going to a STEM-focused university and they're starting to see yield from it. And I think, I know, Kate, you have a similar model with mentorship and advising, but I do believe things will start to converge around you insert sort of academic support. The output of that will also be social support as well. And I know, Farouk, you've seen a lot of that as well.
I think that's such a cool double bottom line, Samyr, thing. The colleges funding tutors to place them into high schools. I mean,
yeah, guess what? The tutors are developing skills too.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love it.
Well, and we're definitely seeing more and more of these technologies that are creating these networks among universities so that students can take advantage of opportunities that are offered by other universities. And you can see that in the online learning. You can see it in the career opportunities and mentoring. I mean, what would it be like if you had the opportunity to connect with a mentor from a different university? Doesn't have to be an alum from your university, for example. That's an opportunity. It's kind of like what the open app process for admissions has taught all of us, is that you can just do one application for all of these colleges. Well, could we have just one type of platform that allows students to attend one university, but also participate in and engage in a bunch of other universities in a variety of ways? So it's these open networks. You know, Kate, you asked a really good question earlier, is that what helps a student, what makes a student persist, what makes them not drop out, or what causes that dropout. And I think at the end of the day, it's really a cost benefit equation that plays out, maybe not so consciously for most of them, but a lot of times students drop out because they can no longer afford it or justify the cost. They're already seeing that for what I am paying, this is not valuable. I'd rather go do something else, even if I can afford it. Or for a lot of them, they just can't. They see the stress and the pressure that this is adding on their own families, and they would rather maybe just take a break, go back and work, especially if they're not thriving academically and socially, as you said, especially if they feel that they're not belonging, that they're not fully engaged in the university experience. A lot of these students are first generation students. They're first to go to college in their families. They have no roadmap on how to navigate this complicated system. And universities, these are creatures of tradition. I've worked in them for the last 2 decades. They can be really intimidating and complex to navigate. And they're almost like stitched together in ways that it doesn't make sense. And the roadmap feels like a maze to someone who hasn't learned how to navigate complex systems from a young age. So that definitely contributes to that. And I think for the last couple of decades, we've seen universities try to address these issues by creating on-ramp programs, off-ramp programs for students of underprivileged backgrounds. But I'll say, as we wrap this conversation up, is that what is really needed is for universities to completely dismantle the systems and rebuild in a way that makes sense for all, that you shouldn't have to be privileged to know how to navigate the University of Chicago. You should be able to just get your admission ticket, and then the roadmap is fairly easy to navigate, and you can take advantage of not only the in-the-classroom opportunities, but the out-of-the-classroom opportunities. I want to wrap this up with just a really quick question that I usually ask all of our guests. In one image or quick sentence or word, how do you describe the future? What's the first image that comes to mind when you think of the future of learning and future of education?
For me, it's bright. I'm excited. I was super impressed with all the admissions offices, how they rallied in COVID. So I love it. I love that higher ed is using the word pivot. I'll give you some more words.
I hope we keep pivoting.
Pick up what Kate said. The future is very bright. And for some people, it may be so bright that they can't see it.
Oh, nice.
I would say future is flexible, right? Optionality is key. If we're going to truly meet the needs of every student, we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach on academics, on student services, on student experiences. And Farouk, by the way, I appreciated your vision. I think you should start a company.
What do I? Okay, then you might need to be my first advisor on it because I have no idea what that vision is. But thank you. I might need to start doing that. Well, I love bright and flexible, and I will add the word equitable to it. I think that's whatever we build in the future must be accessible to all, regardless of background, regardless of social capital. And I think if we do that, and each of you play a role in that already, and that's why I admire the work that you do. And I hope we'll see more companies like yours and more universities adopt that type of philosophy. Thank you so much to you, Ashwin, and Kate, and Samyr for a very thought-provoking conversation. I learned a ton from you today, so I really, really appreciate it. And I hope we'll connect again in the future. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in today. And as I always say, the only vision that matters is the one that you create. Thank you all. I will see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.